Hi everybody, Richard Tromans here again at Artificial Lawyer TV. Today we're doing another special interview, this time with Dennis Kennedy. Hi Dennis.
Hello.
Dennis lived through a very important period in legal technology and software in general, which was the late 90s, early 2000s. And I really wanted to pick his brain and learn from his experience. So thanks for coming on the show, Dennis. Could you just tell the audience a little bit about yourself first?
So I'm Dennis Kennedy. I'm currently the director of Michigan State University's Center for Law, Technology, and Innovation. I was in-house counsel at MasterCard for a good number of years, and I've written about legal technology since 1996. I was the tech columnist for the ABA Journal, one of the first lawyers with a website, one of the first lawyers with a blog. So this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart. And in fact, in the time period we're talking about, I left partnership at a law firm where I was doing estate planning and tax work, and decided that I had to kind of shift my practice and what I was doing over to the internet, because I had the feeling that I had missed the whole internet, back in the about 1996 kind of time frame. So it's a time that's significant to me. A lot of friends from that period, and there's a lot of excitement in that period, and it's interesting how it's sort of repeating in sort of kind of new and better ways. And I think there is a lot of value of looking back to some of those concepts, some of the ideas, and what people were trying then.
Okay, well, we're only going to do this for about 15 minutes, so we don't have a lot of time. So we're going to get into this. So let's just start off with a sort of lay of the land. So in the late 90s, 96 to let's say 2001. Actually, that's probably a good period. 96 to 2001, because 2001 was the dot-com crash. And anyone, I guess, who's about 30 or so or older will remember that quite distinctly, because they may have lost their jobs temporarily during that period, and then bounced back. So Dennis, where was legal tech? What kind of tools were available? What were the big companies who were dominating the market? And what did lawyers think about legal tech? I mean, did lawyers even talk about technology, or did stuff just get shoved under their noses and they used it?
No, I mean, there's a lot going on. I think you feel, there's a lot of energy. I mean, you had the internet really just, on everybody's minds, a lot of things happening. Obviously, email was at least as important then as it still seems to be. That the big transition from Word Perfect to Word was happening. Actually, you had firms going from DOS to Windows at that time. And people were talking about online dispute resolution. You had document assembly. Uh, I remember doing online, CLEs. There's just a lot. There was a lot happening, and it's really kind of interesting because the technology wasn't quite there. Speech recognition was in its early kind of really cool but barely workable form. And so there's a lot of things, but what's interesting is the technology wasn't there in the same way that it is now. So um, you had all these ideas and people trying things that, in retrospect, were unbelievably ambitious,
Well,
that
yeah, I
are
mean, I
now
remember
so possible.
well, totally. I remember reading about one thing, it was just before the dot-com crash, and there was some company that was talking about sort of online video downloads and had been given millions and millions of dollars, which then, of course, went bust in 2001. And I remember afterwards thinking, how on earth would that have even worked to download a video in 2001 on a 56K modem? Would it have taken you like a week?
No, you just like, yeah, I realized like all this stuff was happening, you download something overnight. I remember once there was a company that was starting to do this, what we now call video on demand, continuing legal education. And I went out to Phoenix, and they had like a little studio with an actual green screen at the time that to kind of, put in this sort of theater background, and delivered a presentation with the PowerPoint slides and stuff. And yeah, you're going like, well, how is that going to work over this like over a modem? And now you realize that's why there's like the change in technology. Now you realize, like with Zoom backgrounds or TikTok, you can do all this stuff just as a matter of course.
I mean, it's hard to imagine, isn't it? We think we probably look back at that tech and kind of almost feel sorry for it. But relatively to what was there before, faxes and sending letters, it was revolutionary. And I suppose to be a lawyer in that time must have felt quite exciting. I mean, presumably you were right in the middle of that.
Yeah, I that's why I think there was a group of, just a group of people who you sort of felt like, hey, big change was going to happen. And um, you've formed friendships and got to meet people who are, really influencers in legal tech, which is a very generous community at the time. And people were kind of pushing each other with ideas. And um, like I said, it's really interesting. It is that sort of pioneer thing when you realize, you look back and you say, well, look at the tools that we had compared to now.
But for you guys then, I mean, what did people think was going to happen? I mean, if you had to say, if you had to sum up 2015 to 2017 in one sentence, it would be, oh, the end of lawyers, which was the big bugbear, and people got talking about automation, AI, and so forth. It was the replacement theory. It was very, very, very strong. It was in the air. You could kind of feel it. If you go back to the late 90s, the internet and the beginnings of automation of documents, I guess, and so forth. I mean, what did the lawyers think was going to happen? I mean, did they embrace it? Were they like, oh my God, we're going to get replaced by the internet? Or, I mean, what did they think?
No, I mean, I think that you, I saw things like this technology is going to make your job and your life easier. You know, you're not going to have to work as hard. You're not going to have to work as many hours. So there's talk
Heard that
about,
before.
new business models, but I think a lot of it was, hey, the tools we have to do law are so primitive and they haven't changed in 100 years. Now there are ways that we could work, better, make our lives easier, and better work for clients.
Mm.
And I think that to me was the overriding vibe,
It
and
was it
then
was it was more of a positive thing, whereas I think it's fair to say that the huge burst of the sort of second wave, or the new wave, as I've called it, of legal tech, had mixed feelings. There were people who were probably almost like revolutionary in their passion for it, and still are, whilst some partners were genuinely worried about the whole thing, because they could see, hold on a minute, this undermines the billable hour,
right.
and we don't want everybody to work from home, or we don't want standardization. We don't want stuff to be automated. Hold on a minute, all this technology should be trying to serve us. This is what it's for. And it kind of almost felt like the tables were shifting, turning. Maybe in the 90s, that first wave of legal tech. And of course, there's a pre-wave before that. You can go all the way back to the 1950s if you want to get really historical. But again,
Right.
look at the big waves. It felt like that big wave that you were part of, it was genuinely seen in a benign way. Hey, this is going to help us communicate more. We'll be more productive. It's going to be just nicer, easier. We're going to make more money. It's great. Whereas that second wave, it was more kind of challenging, more disruptive.
Yeah, I think I think that's right. So I would say a couple things that to me felt different, and I'll tell the story. Like in 1990, I first did a document assembly app to create wills, trust, durable powers of attorney. And it took what was a 5-hour process into answering a set of questions and generating a good first draft in 5 minutes. And I was like, when it worked, I was like this is amazing. And then I realized, oh my God, I sort of this really is a problem for me on billable hours, right? And so that always made me think about, if you implement these kind of technologies, you have to reconsider the business model. And I think that the legal profession has just kind of always retrenched to the billable hour. And so, my focus these days is on new business models, productization. And then the other piece I think was missing back in the 90s that you see more of now is looking at the legal profession as part of an ecosystem, right? And
Mhm.
so to say, like, well, can we, if we do this, what impact does it have? COVID, I think, highlighted a lot of that, where you say, okay, so now all the online stuff, client portals, all those things totally make sense because COVID, made that apparent. But people were looking at extranets and client portals, back in the 1990s.
Well, that's true. I mean, I remember Linklaters created this thing called Blue Flag,
Mhm.
which came out in I think 2000 or something. And I honestly, at that point in time, had no idea what it even was, but it sounded extremely exciting. But I think I imagine it was just some kind of extranet system.
Yep. And Brian Cave in the U.S., John Albert did this thing called Trade Zone, which was an extranet, which is now you would see as essentially a guided interview kind of productized app that led clients to, answer some questions, and it would tell them like whether they could do, like how they did, import export work, or when they needed to go to a lawyer. And the
Mm,
lawyers resisted that because they thought it was going to take away their time. But what they found was that their clients brought them more interesting and better questions, and their clients were happy to pay them for that instead of, asking them the same questions over and over again, and being
interesting.
charged by the hour.
So the old billable hour, displacement of business models was around back in the 90s as well. Maybe it just got more pronounced with the arrival of more automation. But let's just talk briefly about the tech companies. I mean, as mentioned, 2015, 2017, there was this surge. I mean, there was statistical evidence that just shows that literally dozens and dozens of startups were created in the legal tech field in that period. Just huge, huge numbers. It's tailed off a lot now. Some of them have been bought, some have gone bust, some are chugging along, and now I guess what you would call scale ups. I mean, back in the 90s, did you have a huge amount of startups that you were aware of? I mean, like really small, you know, like a couple of people straight out of, law school types. And I mean, who were the big companies then? I mean, LexisNexis was still LexisNexis back then. Thomson Reuters didn't exist, of course, people forget that Thomson Reuters is the result of the merger of Thomson and Reuters, which was in what, 2007, 2008,
Yeah, I don't know. That makes sense to
2006.
me.
I can't
I
remember.
don't
It was
remember
around the mid
exactly.
2000s, wasn't it? So Thomson Reuters didn't even exist then, but obviously Thomson and its Westlaw products and all of its legal research did. So I guess, and Walters Kluwer, Bloomberg hadn't really got into law at that point. So I mean, who were the other big players back in the 90s?
Well, I don't. I mean, it's interesting because I think there were startups, and they tended to get, bought up by Lexus and Thompson West,
Mm,
at the time, and that was sort of like the exit strategy. It was kind of like
mm,
you got bought, you became successful enough, and you got onto their radar, and you got bought out. But remember, everything was software at the time,
mm,
so this was before. I mean, although what we would now call the cloud kind of existed, and software as a service definitely existed, in the late 90s, because I was doing legal work in that area at the time. Um, but I think the Clio and Rocket Matters didn't come around until 10 years later, probably. And the, so so you had these small software companies, and you had certain, the sort of niche areas, so there was case management,
mm,
uh, Time Matters, Amicus, all those sorts of things were out there.
mm.
Um,
And
and you had
e-discovery, of course, as well.
yeah, although e-discovery, I mean, lawyers were still resisting it, so in that period, like e-discovery at most would have been figuring out how to deal with emails. The innovation kind of comes, the great innovations come when you have like these constraints, and that was one of the things you would see where you go like,
Mm,
okay, like you say, there's sort of on-demand video, like, okay, so what if somebody has a slow modem, then how do I do video? Well, you have to compress the video, right? You have to maybe have it download overnight. It's doable, but you can't, like the on demand uh, part of it can't be real time.
But
get the
I like
technology.
that. I like that thought very much, that, that innovation comes from constraints or from wanting to overcome the constraints. And of course, and I think that puts a really, really important focus on wanting to. And I guess that alludes back to a couple of the articles that I've written more recently about, you know, driving change, it has to be because the lawyers want it, because they see it as creating greater value in the broader value chain and so forth. And it's a hard one to contend with, isn't it? But let's just, because we've got to finish soon, but let's just look at the past and then where we are now. What are, for you, what are the greatest parallels between 2022 and let's say, I don't know, 2002, 20 years ago, or just before then? I mean, how much are things the same and how much are things very different?
Well, I think the parallels that I really like are, there's so much creativity and innovation. There's this really great new generation, in my thinking, of people in legal tech, and they have the ability to try things through the startup venture capital world in a way that wasn't done in the past. So that's really interesting. There is this realization now, um, I think more so than back then, that there's a lot of systems that are really broken, and so it's important to try new things.
When you say system, you mean systems within the legal sector?
Yeah, I mean, I think you look at the court systems, you look
Mm.
at regulatory systems, you look at the business practices of firms, you look at hiring practices, you look at, everything that in the US we call access to justice. There's a lot of, legal education. It's all kind of messed up, and we see it. You have the feeling you did with those early days of the internet. There's just tremendous possibility, and
Mm.
all things were possible, and you have this new generation that can do this. Definitely more diverse, emphasis on access to justice, making change, and saying like the old way isn't cutting it anymore. And
Mm.
that energy is really exciting to me. I think probably if I look back in '98, we were kind of really interested in technology. Like you said, how do we make our lives easier? How do we work better? How do we make these, come up with better ways of doing things? I think now there's the more that sense of we can really take some big swings with technology and kind of change things.
Absolutely. Well, look, thanks very much, Dennis. But we've got to sign off. But I hope everyone enjoyed that. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you.